The harp played softly through the hall as the scent of roasted meat and wine filled the air. Candles trembled against the stone walls, and laughter rose like smoke into the vaulted ceiling. For one night it seemed that peace had returned to Scotland. Nobles toasted to the future, while servants poured crimson wine into silver cups that caught the light like liquid fire. No one noticed how the doors had closed behind them, or how the guards had taken new positions along the shadows of the walls. At the high table sat two boys dressed in fine velvet. William Douglas was 16 and already carried himself with the calm of a young noble. Beside him, his brother David smiled with the open trust of a child. They had been invited to reconcile with the crown, to mend the rift that had divided Scotland. Around them, voices spoke of loyalty and forgiveness. The king was only a boy himself, bright-eyed and eager to believe that peace was possible. For a moment, innocence ruled the room. Then the harp fell silent. A servant stepped forward carrying a silver platter. On it rested the head of a black bull, the ancient symbol of death. The hall froze. Flames flickered lower as if afraid to witness what would follow. No word was spoken. The two brothers stared at the offering, their laughter dying on their lips. Every guest knew what it meant. The feast had become a sentence. History calls it the Black Dinner, but in truth it was Scotland's first lesson in how mercy dies in the hands of fear. If you believe that every crown hides a crime, follow and subscribe to our channel, where history still bleeds. When King James I was struck down by assassins, Scotland did not lose a monarch. It lost the fragile illusion of order. His son, James II, was a child barely old enough to hold a crown, much less the weight of a broken kingdom. Power slipped quickly into the hands of men who called themselves guardians, men who wore the crown's light on their faces, but never carried its burden in their hearts. They ruled in his name, but their loyalty was not to the boy or to the realm. It was to the fear that kept them alive. The court had no king, only caretakers sharpening knives in candlelight. The throne room became a place of whispers rather than commands, of documents signed by trembling hands, pretending to be the voice of a ruler. Outside the castle walls, Scotland was a country held together by suspicion. The noble houses watched each other as wolves do across an empty field. None were more feared than the Douglases. Their castles guarded the border, their banners filled the valleys, and their armies answered no summons but their own. To the regents of the young king, the Douglases were not subjects. They were a shadow monarchy. Their wealth rivaled that of the crown, their loyalty uncertain, their pride legendary. Fear crept into every council meeting where their name was spoken. It was said that to challenge them was to awaken an ancient storm that even the crown could not command. But fear breeds invention, and invention breeds betrayal. Among the guardians of the throne stood William Crichton, the Chancellor of Scotland. To some he was a statesman, but to others he was something colder. A man who understood that power survives not through honor, but through the quiet elimination of those who threaten it. Crichton had risen through the cracks of the kingdom like a vine, winding his influence around the young king, whispering that safety could be bought only with blood. He was not cruel for pleasure, but for calculation. His mind was a forge where anxiety became strategy. While James II played with wooden soldiers, Crichton studied real ones. While the boy dreamed of peace, the Chancellor counted enemies. Each move he made was careful, each smile rehearsed, each promise a prelude to necessity. He looked upon the Douglas brothers not as rivals, but as inevitabilities. Their youth did not soften him. In their faces he saw the prophecy of rebellion. To the child king, William Douglas was a companion. To Crichton, he was a blade still waiting to be drawn. And so the pieces began to shift upon the board, small at first, almost invisible. Messages carried by couriers, rumors whispered through corridors, alliances tested under the pretext of friendship. The kingdom continued to breathe, but its breath was shallow and uneven, as if sensing that something unseen was already pressing upon its chest. It was an age of orphans, ruled by men who mistook fear for wisdom, and in that fear, Scotland's fate began to tighten like a knot that no hand of mercy could ever untie. The invitation arrived not as a threat, but as an embrace. It was written in the language of peace, sealed with the mark of the crown, and delivered by hands that trembled with practiced grace. Every word promised safety. Every gesture whispered reconciliation. For a realm exhausted by fear, it seemed like a breath of mercy. To young William Douglas, it was more than that. It was a chance to prove loyalty, to show that the blood of his family could still stand beside the throne without demanding it. Those who served him warned that peace offered by frightened men is never peace at all. Yet William was 16, and youth does not know the shape of betrayal until it stands before it. He believed in the sacred law of hospitality, a law older than kings, older than crowns, a law that said no guest could be harmed beneath the roof of his host. It was the one custom that held the wild heart of Scotland together. He could not imagine that men would shatter it. The day they set out for Edinburgh was cold and bright. Frost glistened on the heather, and the wind carried the scent of iron from the hills. The brothers rode ahead of their small escort, laughing, unaware that the road they followed was the color of mourning. Farmers bowed as they passed, not out of fear but respect, for the Douglas name was a fortress in their memories. Yet each step of their horses' hooves sounded like a drumbeat echoing toward an end no one could see. Within the walls of Edinburgh Castle, preparations were already complete. The great hall was polished until the stone shone like glass. Candles were placed with mathematical precision, as if light itself were part of the deception. The boy king waited nervously, repeating lines of welcome taught by his advisors. He had no part in the conspiracy that coiled around him. His heart was too young to hold such cruelty. When he imagined the Douglases arriving, he saw friends, not victims. As the castle bells tolled in the afternoon air, William and David crossed the drawbridge. Trumpets sounded. Courtiers smiled too quickly. Ribbons fluttered from the windows as if to celebrate something holy. Yet beneath the velvet and silver, beneath the ritual of honor, another rhythm moved, darker and patient, like the heartbeat of a predator waiting for the right silence to strike. Wine was poured before words were spoken. The scent of it filled the hall, rich and sweet, masking the faint bitterness of deceit. When the young earl raised his cup to the king, it was not a toast to victory or power. It was a boy's fragile belief that good faith could tame fear. Around him, the men who plotted his death lifted their cups as well, faces serene, hands steady. They believed they were attending peace. They were attending their own disappearance. The cups were still raised when the air began to change. The laughter that had filled the great hall only moments before thinned into uneasy silence. A final note from the harp trembled and faded, leaving a hollow echo behind. The scent of wine clung to the room, rich and heavy, as if it refused to vanish. Servants moved slower, their eyes lowered, their hands trembling. The light from hundreds of candles flickered as though it too sensed the end approaching. William Douglas felt the shift first. His cup remained half lifted. the wine within reflecting the wavering light like dark glass. His younger brother, Lord David Douglas, whispered something he could not hear, a question swallowed by the quiet. Across from them, King James II watched with the uncertain poise of youth, his crown slightly tilted, his smile faint and frightened. He did not understand the silence. He thought it was reverence. He did not know it was fear. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing against the stone floor. From the far end of the hall, a servant emerged, carrying a silver platter polished to perfection. Upon it rested the head of a black bull, its dead eyes reflecting the candlelight in dull sparks. The tray touched the table with a single metallic sound that rang through the stillness like a bell calling for judgment. Every noble present knew the meaning of the symbol. Death had entered the room. King James II turned toward William Crichton, searching for explanation, but found only the cold mask of authority. Crichton gave no word, only a glance to the guards. William Douglas rose halfway from his chair, drawing his brother close, the instinct of protection rising above all else. The soldiers stepped forward, closing the iron doors. Their armor whispered like breath against stone. The boy king tried to speak, but his voice was stifled by the hands that once served him. He cried for mercy, but mercy was no longer welcome at this table. Every oath of loyalty dissolved into silence. No plea would be heard. When the blades were drawn, the hall filled not with chaos, but with stillness so profound that time itself seemed to recoil. Lord William Douglas's defiance flickered only for a moment, then vanished beneath the weight of inevitability. The scent of roasted meat gave way to the sharper smell of iron. The feast that had begun in hope now tasted of betrayal. When the first sword fell, it made no sound of triumph. It struck within a silence so deep, it became eternal. The laughter, the harp, the warmth, all erased. Only the trembling of candlelight remained, bearing witness to the unmaking of innocence. King James II closed his eyes and wept without voice, his tears unseen in the dim glow. That night, innocence died quietly, without a scream. Only the sound of a feast gone cold. The silence that followed the black dinner lasted longer than the echo of any sword. It settled over Scotland like a fog that refused to lift. Within the walls of Edinburgh Castle, the scent of blood was washed away, but something deeper remained. It lingered in the stones, in the corridors, in the memory of those who had watched and said nothing. The great hall was cleaned and polished, the silver restored, the banners rehung. Yet no music dared to rise again in that place. No one spoke of the feast, but everyone remembered. The law of hospitality that had once bound noble to noble was now a ghost. Invitations were received with caution. Letters opened with trembling hands. A simple meal between lords could no longer be trusted. The act of breaking bread had turned from a sign of peace into a silent threat. Every banquet carried the shadow of that night. The unspoken fear that wine might once again mask the taste of betrayal. King James II grew within this silence. He walked through the same corridors where laughter had once lived. But he never heard laughter the same way again. The boy who had wept beside the fallen Douglases became a man who trusted no one. He spoke softly, watched constantly, and smiled only when required. The courtiers around him learned quickly that kindness was dangerous, that favor could turn to punishment without warning. The kingdom itself began to mirror its king. Fear became law, and suspicion became the new currency of power. Those who had once ruled through alliances now ruled through avoidance. Meetings were shorter, words chosen carefully, and gestures measured as if each might awaken a memory best left sleeping. Even within the royal court, every conversation felt rehearsed. The throne that had once united Scotland now divided it with quiet precision. No decree was needed, no war declared. Trust had simply died, and its death carried more weight than 1,000 soldiers. At night, King James II dreamed of the feast. The candles still burned in his mind, and the sound of silence returned to him with cruel clarity. He saw again the silver platter, the black bull's head, the faces of 2 boys who had once called him friend. He had not lifted a sword, yet his name would forever be tied to their deaths. The guilt became his inheritance, the shadow that followed every step of his reign. In time, he learned the truth that Chancellor William Crichton had always known, though in a different way. Power does not need enemies to destroy itself. It only needs fear. And fear, once welcomed into a throne room, never leaves. It feeds on loyalty, devours love, and teaches even kings to doubt their own reflection. So Scotland endured, not through peace or justice, but through quiet surrender. The crown still shone, but its light no longer warmed. What had begun as a single betrayal had become a kingdom built on caution, where every smile hid a secret, and every silence carried the memory of the feast that had never truly ended. The name Douglas did not perish with the blood that stained the stone floors of Edinburgh Castle. It drifted through the valleys of Scotland like smoke, settling in every hearth where loyalty still remembered. Their castles fell silent, their banners were torn, yet their memory endured. The Douglases had become more than flesh and name. They were an echo, an unfinished sentence whispered across generations. Among those left behind, Lady Margaret Douglas carried their silence like a crown of sorrow. Once praised as the fair maid of Galloway, she became the face of loyalty betrayed. Her grief was not a storm, but a winter, still and endless. Each morning she walked the cold corridors of her estate, her hands brushing the walls as though she could still feel the pulse of her nephew's laughter there. Servants said she spoke to no one, but candles were found burned to the wick in empty rooms, as if her prayers had turned to whispers with the dead. In that stillness, she began to weave her defiance. Messengers rode at night, bearing her letters sealed without a name. Across Scotland, men who had once served the Douglases returned, not to raise armies, but to remember. Even those who had feared the clan now spoke of them as if they were saints of a broken kingdom. The crown sought to bury them, but the deeper the burial, the stronger the roots. The Douglases no longer ruled from castles. They ruled from memory. King James II, who had watched their deaths as a child, grew beneath the shadow of that night. He had been king in title, but not in soul. The power that should have guided him was replaced by suspicion. At every feast, at every council, he saw the ghosts of Lord William Douglas and Lord David Douglas watching him from the corners of the hall. They did not speak, yet their silence followed him like judgment. When another Earl of Douglas rose to prominence years later, the young monarch felt the circle closing. He saw in that man's face the echo of the boys he had once called friends. Fear returned, patient and familiar. In that fear, he became the very force that had shaped his childhood. His hands, once small and trembling sighed a feast of betrayal, now signed the order for another Douglas to die. The curse was complete. The blood that had been spilled to secure peace had only sown more death. By destroying the Douglases, the crown had carved their ghost into its own heart. Scotland would forever live beneath their shadow, and its kings would carry their memory like a wound that never healed. In killing the Douglases, he had only inherited their curse. The story of the Black Dinner does not end with the fall of the Douglases or the guilt of a boy king. Its true ending was never written in ink, but carved into the memory of the world itself. Every kingdom that came after carried a trace of that night, for it revealed something that rulers had always suspected but never spoken aloud. Power does not need cruelty to survive. It only needs fear disguised as order, ceremony disguised as mercy. That feast was not simply a betrayal. It was a ritual, a moment when the illusion of honor was lifted and the machinery of control stood naked beneath the candlelight. It taught generations that violence wrapped in ritual feels less like sin and more like necessity. The men who orchestrated the banquet believed they were saving the realm, yet what they created was a pattern that every throne since has followed, a system where faith is currency, loyalty is weapon, and silence is the only form of survival. Centuries have passed, but the architecture of that fear still stands. It has only changed its shape. It lives now in the corridors of power, in every quiet meeting where truth is softened to preserve control. It lingers in governments, in courts, in the way nations celebrate their victories while hiding the bodies buried beneath them. The Black Dinner was not a medieval story. It was an invention of civilization itself, the moment when betrayal became a tool of governance. Today, visitors walk through the great hall of Edinburgh Castle, their footsteps soft on the polished floor. They see the walls, the high windows, the restored stonework, and believe the past has been conquered. They do not feel the cold that still seeps through the air or the silence that listens from the corners. The blood is gone, but the memory breathes in the dust. The hall no longer echoes with music, yet it hums with the same quiet tension, as though history itself still waits for the next course to be served. If you pause long enough, you can hear it. Not the screams, not the clash of steel, but the stillness that came after. That moment when the world understood that even innocence can be sacrificed in the name of peace. That was the birth of political fear, the true heir to every throne that has ever existed. 5 centuries later, the plates are clean, but the table remembers. If you believe every crown hides a crime, subscribe to our channel, where history still bleeds.